Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 34, verse 14, and asking who or what is Lilith. That term Lilith is used in the Hebrew text in Isaiah chapter 34. Let me give you the verse before our verse and the verse afterwards, where you get a sense of the context. Isaiah 34 is a judgment section where it's speaking about judgment against the nations and about those who set themselves against God. And part of that judgment begins here in chapter 34, verse 13. Thorns will come up in its fortified towers, nettles and thistles in its fortified cities. That's bad things when wild plants are growing in your towers, in your cities. It will also be a haunt of jackals and an abode of ostriches. Notice these wild animals that come and live in these fortified cities and these towers, depicting the cities and towers as now being ruined. Verse 14 goes on, the desert creatures will meet with the wolves. Notice there's those desert creatures, there's wolves. The hairy goat will also cry to its kind. And here's our word here. Yes, the night monster, and this is the Hebrew word Lilith is used. We're going to ask what that means. We're going to go back and ask what sort of monster, or is that even a good translation? But notice we'll settle there and we'll find herself a resting place. The passage goes on. Verse 15, the tree snake will make its nest and lay eggs there, and it will hatch and gather them under its protection. Yes, the hawks will be gathered there, every one with its kind. And so notice Lilith is mentioned in both before and after. It are a bunch of animals of the desert, wild animals of the desert. And in the middle of that is this phrase known as Lilith. So here's the Hebrew, and I'm giving you a transliteration under it. Lilith. The King James version translates this the screech owl. It's one of many animals. Um, so the screech owl. The English Standard Version renders it the night bird. The New English translation, the nocturnal animals. The New International Version, night creatures. The RSV, night hag, and both the Masoretic uh, Jewish Bible and the Tanakh translation. Just they don't translate it at all; they just transliterate it. They actually just render it Lilith, which is the Hebrew word with just English letters. I don't have a problem when translators do that. Sometimes they don't know how to translate a word; they just leave it. Now, notice among these various translations that night or nocturnal is in quite a few of them. Even the King James version, the screech owls are especially they come out at night. They tend to be a nocturnal bird. And so notice the night theme. The reason for the night theme is because the Hebrew word Lila, and if you look at the Hebrew or even the English letters, remember that you don't write vowels in Hebrew, you only write consonants. But Lila is the Hebrew word for night. In fact, if you want to say good night, you say Lila Tov. It's good night, or Boker Tov would be good morning. So Lila is the Hebrew word for night. And so it sounds like it has something to do with a night something or other, night bird, night creature, night something. And the translators have wrestled with that. Now, the Isaiah scroll, this was one of the very first Dead Sea Scrolls to be found. It's known by its catalog number 1Q Isaiah, which means it was cave one, the very first cave they found scrolls in, and then it was associated with Qumran, and then it was the Isaiah scroll. There were actually two Isaiah scrolls that were discovered in that first cave. But in that particular scroll, it has the same passage, and yet it renders it as a plural instead of a singular. So if it's instead of night bird, you might say night birds in the plural. Um, Although in other of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because actually Isaiah was one of the scrolls, they found many different copies of at least portions of Isaiah. And in other ones, I think it was in Cave 4, it was in the singular just as it is in our Masoretic text in our Hebrew Bible. So a little bit of somebody perhaps made a typo as they were copying it, either making it a singular or a plural. I don't know that that changes the meaning at all. Now, this term Lilith then was taken by Gnostics, those who were trying to search for some hidden meaning in the Bible. They weren't content with the meaning that's there. They wanted to change that and get away from it. And also later Jewish mystics of the medieval era. And they took this verse and this term and they fashioned an entire storyline from it. They said, well, Lilith was the first wife of Adam, and that she was replaced by Eve because she wasn't submissive like she was supposed to be, and so she was cast out, and then God created Eve. Now, where they were getting that from was they said, well, Genesis chapter 1 and verses 26 and 27, where God says, let us make man in our image, and then he does that in verse 27, and he said, and he made them male and female. And then you turn to Genesis chapter 2 that describes the creation of Eve. And they said, well, see, you had a man and woman created in Genesis 1, and then Eve is created in Genesis 2. So this must have been an earlier creation. It reminds me a little bit of the little girl. Actually, this is a true story. The little girl had become a brand new Christian, and she wanted to read about Jesus. So she got out the Bible, and she began reading the story of Jesus in Matthew. And then when she was finished with Matthew, she read Mark and Luke and John. And she said to herself, my goodness, they kept crucifying him over and over and over again, not realizing it was two different stories, or in that case, four different stories of the same event, just told in four different ways. Well, I take and most scholars take Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 as two different stories, just describing the same event, but describing them that in different ways. So that in Genesis chapter 1, you see the creation of the man and the woman, sort of not with any details, just that he made them male and female. And then Genesis 2 tells how that took place. But notice these Gnostics and Jewish mystics were saying, well, no, that must be two different events, two different sets of people. I think it was just very poor hermeneutics, very poor reading of the scriptures. You go on in later Jewish legends to see Lilith described and pictured as a female demon who goes out and just like Satan goes out and does bad things, Lilith goes out, and trinkets were placed on uncircumcised babies to keep the demon, this demoness, away. I don't know if demoness is actually a word, so forgive me. And then when a man would have some sort of nocturnal emission, a wet dream or something like that, it must have been Lilith that came and brought that about. So all of these myths and stories and folklore that were told by our Jewish friends. I think the Apostle Paul speaks to this sort of thing. He's not talking about Lilith, because I don't know that Lilith, those stories had come about yet in his day. But he says, for this reason, this is in Titus chapter 1, reprove them severely so they may be sound in the faith, not paying attention to Jewish myths. Because, yes, they were pagan myths, but there were also Jewish myths. And certainly the pagan world is filled with all sorts of mythology. But notice how, even in Paul's day, there were certain Jewish mythology that had crept in, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. And attention to this sort of mythology is a way to try to escape the truth of God's true commands, his true teachings. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, this is a bit later, Paul is writing to Timothy, and he says, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled. And, there's something about stories like Lilith and other stories of mythology that are just fun for people to involve themselves in. Wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths, and in this case, Jewish myths. But you, and notice the contrast, there are those that chase after this mythology or that mythology, but Paul says to Timothy, but you be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. Notice, to do the work of evangelism, that means focus. Focus on the important thing. Focus on the gospel of Jesus Christ. How God sent his own son to die in our place. And don't be led astray by these foolish myths, these foolish stories that take you in all sorts of other directions, but all they do is tickle your ears and lead you astray.